The Big Snow, the Olympic Peninsula of Washington State, had always been unforgiving wilderness, massive Douglas firs and western red cedars stretching endlessly, their crowns disappearing into permanent mists. On November 3, 2025, the region experienced one of its earliest and most severe snowfalls in recorded history. What began as light flurries 3 days earlier had intensified with shocking rapidity, dumping thick powder that accumulated at over 3 inches per hour. By morning, the forest was transformed, blanketed in snow 4 feet deep in places. The heavy, wet snow clung to every surface, bending branches nearly to the ground and muffling all sound until the forest seemed wrapped in cotton. The temperature had plummeted to 18 degrees Fahrenheit, with no relief forecast for at least 72 hours. Ice formed on every exposed surface, making footing treacherous. This was where 5 forestry workers found themselves that grey morning, tasked with clearing a remote logging road that had become impassable. Cascade Timber Industries had been pushing hard to meet end-of-year quotas, and the early snow had thrown schedules into chaos. Marcus Whitfield, the crew supervisor at 41, had worked these forests for 18 years. He knew the risks: equipment failures in sub-zero temperatures, rock slides blocking roads for days, the dangers that came with the territory. The Olympic forests felt different from other timber regions, older and more primal, with sections of old growth that had never been touched, trees standing for 500 years or more. There were stories, of course, whispered among crews during long shifts, when exhaustion loosened tongues. Stories about things that moved through the deepest forest sections, things that left tracks too large to be bare and too human-like to be comfortable. Marcus had heard them all, had dismissed most as folklore. But he'd seen tracks himself on 3 separate occasions. Tracks too large, with too many human characteristics, to dismiss entirely. Beside him in the Snowcat sat Jennifer Chen, 34, the crew's equipment specialist who could repair anything mechanical. She'd joined 3 years earlier after a decade in automotive repair, drawn by better pay, but staying because she genuinely enjoyed the work and keeping complex equipment running in challenging conditions. In the rear compartment, 3 other crew members organized equipment. David Patterson, 29, was the youngest but had grown up in these forests and knew them intimately. He was engaged to be married in the spring and had been boring his co-workers with wedding details for weeks. Sarah Mitchell, 38, had left accounting at 27 for forestry work, drawn to outdoor labor and the physical exhaustion that helped her sleep without anxiety. She was thoughtful and careful, never cutting corners on safety protocols. Robert Chen, 42, was Jennifer's older brother who'd convinced her to join the company. He served as the crew's unofficial morale booster, always ready with jokes to break tension. He had 2 young sons at home and often talked about moving into management for more regular hours. The Snowcat had been performing admirably, its tracked treads churning through snow that would have been impassable for wheeled vehicles. Marcus had requested this particular unit, Snow 7, specifically because of its reputation for reliability. They were approximately 27 miles from Clearwater, a tiny settlement of 300 residents that existed primarily to service the logging industry. The road they were clearing serviced operations deep in recently accessed forest, following years of negotiations with federal agencies and opposition from environmental groups. They'd left Clearwater at 5:30 that morning, driving slowly through pre-dawn darkness. The journey took over 3 hours to cover 27 miles, with Marcus occasionally stopping to assess conditions before proceeding. Around mid-morning, they reached their primary objective. A massive Douglas fir, 6 feet in diameter, had fallen across the road. They would need to section it with chainsaws and use the Snowcat's winch to drag sections clear, but first, they needed to address the grinding noise the Snowcat had developed. Marcus brought the vehicle to a halt about 50 meters from the fallen tree and announced they'd need to inspect the tracks. The wind had picked up considerably, howling through trees and sending cascades of snow falling from overloaded branches. Visibility was deteriorating as gusts whipped up swirling columns of snow. Marcus could feel the temperature dropping further, cold seeping through his layers. What none of them knew was that their intrusion had not gone unnoticed. The logging operations had pushed into territories undisturbed for generations, areas so remote that even hikers rarely ventured there. They had disturbed something most dismissed as folklore. The Olympic forests had sheltered mysteries for centuries. The indigenous Kino people had stories about the Siatiks, wild men of the forest who avoided human contact but could be dangerous if threatened. White settlers called them Sasquatch or Bigfoot, but brought the same essential message. Something large and human-like lived in the deepest forests, something best left alone. The timber operations had pushed into territories the creatures considered their own, felled trees that served as landmarks, driven away game, filled the forest with chainsaw and engine noise. The creatures had watched from shadows. Some had moved deeper into the mountains, but others remained, growing increasingly aggressive. And at least one male had decided these intruders needed to be driven away or destroyed. David and Sarah climbed out of the rear compartment to examine the right track assembly. The cold hit like a physical blow, and they instinctively hunched their shoulders, pulling hoods tighter against stinging snow. They moved to the right side, boots sinking deep with each step, and crouched to examine where the grinding seemed to originate. The problem wasn't immediately obvious. David suggested ice buildup in the tensioning system, and Sarah nodded, beginning to clear snow and ice. For a better look, Sarah first noticed the silence, the unnatural quality beyond the muffling effect of snow. The wind still howled through upper branches, but there was an absence of other sounds, no birds calling, no small animals, none of the subtle background noise that usually filled a forest. She mentioned this to David, and after listening, he nodded agreement, though his voice carried false confidence when he said animals sheltered during heavy snow. But even as he spoke, he felt the hairs on his neck rising, that primitive warning that humans inherited from prey ancestors, that sense of being watched. He stood, ostensibly to stretch, but really to scan the tree line. Then they noticed the smell, faint at first, but growing stronger as wind shifted. A musky odor completely out of place in the frozen landscape. Not the clean scent of snow and pine, nor diesel or sweat. Something organic, alive, both animal and not quite animal, triggering deep instinctive responses that bypassed rational thought. Sarah stood, her hand instinctively moving to her radio, when she saw movement in the tree line, approximately 50 meters distant. At first she thought it might be a bear, though bears should be hibernating. But the shape seemed wrong. Too tall, too upright, too human in proportions. The creature stood at least 8 feet tall, clearly massive, standing distinctly bipedal in a way that was deeply disturbing. It was covered in dark reddish-brown hair, matted with snow and ice, thick and shaggy. Its shoulders were impossibly broad, suggesting devastating physical power. The arms hung low, reaching nearly to its knees, reminiscent of ape proportions, but on a scale exceeding any known primate. The face appeared almost human, but fundamentally wrong, with features suggesting intelligence, but utterly alien. She could see a heavy brow ridge, flat nose and wide mouth, but the eyes, even at 50 meters through falling snow, were visible, dark and large, locked directly on her with an intensity that made her feel like prey. David saw it in the same moment. Years of growing up in these forests, of hearing stories and half believing them, had prepared him at some subconscious level. His body reacted before his mind fully processed what he was seeing. He grabbed Sarah's arm and pulled her toward the Snowcat, shouting for the others, his voice cracking with undisguised fear. In the cab, Marcus and Jennifer heard the shout and the unmistakable terror in David's voice. They turned to see the 2 crew members scrambling toward the vehicle with desperation. that immediately communicated mortal danger. Robert was already moving toward the rear door when the creature made its presence known in a way that would haunt their nightmares forever. The vocalization that emerged from the tree line was unlike anything any of them had ever heard. It started as a low rumble they could feel in their chests, resonating at frequencies that made their hearts skip beats, then built to a piercing scream that seemed to vibrate in their bones and bypass rational thought to tap directly into primal terror of being prey. The sound was impossibly loud, audible over the howling wind, echoing off surrounding trees. It went on for 10 or 12 seconds that felt like eternity, rising and falling in pitch and volume. When it finally cut off, the silence felt even more oppressive. For a heartbeat, everyone was frozen, paralyzed by the overwhelming sensory experience. Then the creature moved, and paralysis broke as survival instincts kicked into desperate overdrive. The creature emerged fully from the tree line, moving with shocking speed, its long legs covering ground in great strides. It moved through deep snow with ease, suggesting perfect adaptation, its large feet apparently spreading its weight. Sarah and David reached the rear compartment and scrambled inside, David pulling the door shut just as the creature reached the vehicle. The impact was tremendous, rocking the entire vehicle with such violence that secured equipment tore from mountings and flew through the interior. The sound was like a car crash, metal deforming under impossible stress. Marcus, standing near the front preparing to exit, was thrown against the dashboard, his shoulder slamming into the metal frame with enough force to partially separate the joint. Shooting pain made him cry out as he crumpled against the passenger seat. Jennifer grabbed the dashboard to steady herself, just as a second impact rocked the vehicle from a different angle as the creature circled and struck again. Through the windshield, she caught her first clear look at their attacker, and the sight sent absolute terror through her. The creature was massive beyond imagination, easily 8.5 or 9 feet tall, probably 600 or 700 pounds of solid muscle under that shaggy coat. It stood fully upright, proportions violating every understanding of anatomy. The creature used massive fists to hammer the vehicle's exterior, each blow producing a sound like a sledgehammer striking steel. Jennifer could see dents forming in the hood, metal designed to withstand rough treatment deforming under the blows. It moved around the Snowcat with surprising agility, testing different points, searching for weaknesses, vocalizing between that bone-chilling scream and lower guttural sounds that seemed almost like words. The creature's face was visible now through the windshield, close enough that Jennifer could see individual hairs, close enough to see condensation from its breath fogging the glass, close enough to look directly into those dark eyes and see intelligence looking back. The face was disturbingly human-like, but wrong. The eyes were large and dark, nearly black, holding intelligence somehow more terrifying than mindless rage, because it meant this thing was thinking, assessing, planning its attack with purpose. She screamed and scrambled backward, pressing against Marcus. The creature's hand, definitely a hand rather than a paw, came down on the hood with enough force to create a 3-inch deep depression, showing clear imprint of palm and fingers. The fingers were incredibly long, 8 or 9 inches from palm to tip, tipped with thick nails that scraped metal. As the hand lifted and struck again and again, Marcus forced himself to focus through shoulder pain and reached for emergency equipment. His right arm was nearly useless, but his left still worked. He fumbled open the compartment and pulled out a road flare. Jennifer helped him light it, and together they shoved it through the partially open window, bright red flames sputtering to life. The flare seemed to enrage rather than frighten the creature. It turned full attention to the driver's side, and Marcus barely closed the window before the creature's fist came down on the roof directly above his head, denting metal inward. The creature hammered the roof repeatedly, and with each impact, Marcus felt certain the next blow would break through, that those impossibly strong hands would close around his head and end everything. In the rear compartment, David, Sarah, and Robert experienced their own terror as the creature moved around the vehicle, occasionally appearing at small windows. Each appearance was a fresh shock, that massive face filling the window, those dark eyes peering in with what seemed like curiosity mixed with aggression. Assessing them, cataloguing positions, Robert grabbed a heavy metal pry bar and began hammering it against interior walls, creating a cacophony he hoped might drive the creature away. The sound inside the cramped compartment was deafening, but he kept it up, varying rhythm and force. Sarah pulled out her phone, hoping for cell signal, but the screen showed no bars, no connection to the outside world, no possibility of calling for help. They were completely isolated, trapped in a vehicle being systematically destroyed with no way to communicate. The realization hit her like a physical blow. They might actually die here. David frantically searched emergency supplies for anything that might serve as a weapon. They had bear spray, but the canister had frozen. His hands closed on a portable air horn, and he triggered it without hesitation, piercing blast filling the compartment and surely audible outside. The combination of air horn, continued metal hammering, and flares seemed to have some effect. The assault paused, and through windows they could see it step back slightly, massive head swinging side to side as it assessed this unexpected resistance. For a moment, hope flickered. Maybe they'd actually succeeded in driving it away. But the pause lasted only seconds before the creature renewed its attack with even greater violence, as if their resistance had angered rather than frightened it. It moved to the rear and grabbed the door, and they could hear metal groaning under impossible stress as it tried to tear the door from its hinges. Robert threw himself against the door from inside, adding his weight to the locking mechanism, though he knew that if the creature got a proper grip and applied full strength, no lock would hold. Sarah joined him, pressing her back against the door, boots braced against the opposite wall, and she found herself praying for the first time since childhood, formless, desperate pleas that the door would hold or the creature would lose interest. The rear door held, but the frame bent, creating gaps that let in frigid air and swirling snow. Through one gap, Robert found himself staring directly into one of the creature's eyes, close enough to see the pupil contract, close enough to see gold flecks in the dark iris, close enough to see his own terrified reflection. The eye held unmistakable intelligence. And in that moment, Robert understood with absolute clarity that they were not dealing with an animal operating on instinct, but with something that thought and planned and made decisions. The realization was more frightening than the physical danger because it meant the creature could learn, and could adapt, could find ways around their defenses through reasoning. Then the creature released the door and moved again, and they heard it climbing onto the roof. Its weight was enormous, and they could hear the metal roof groaning and beginning to buckle, hear rivets popping free with sounds like small caliber gunshots. Equipment hanging from the ceiling began to shift and fall as the roof deformed. Jennifer continued lighting flares, hands shaking violently, throwing them through the window whenever she could summon courage. The ground around the Snowcat was now dotted with sputtering red lights, casting eerie shadows, creating a perimeter of fire that should have deterred any animal, but that the creature seemed to ignore. The creature on the roof began using what sounded like rocks or ice chunks to hammer against the roof, each impact producing a resounding boom and sending visible dents appearing in the metal above their heads. Marcus could see metal failing, cracks beginning at stress points, and he knew that if the creature broke through, they would be completely defenseless. He grabbed for dashboard controls, intending to start the engine and drive away. But when he turned the key, nothing happened. The initial attack must have damaged the electrical system or fuel lines. The engine refused to respond, leaving them trapped in an immobile metal box, being systematically destroyed. The assault continued for what Marcus later estimated at 15 to 20 minutes. Thought had become meaningless. Every second felt like an hour. Every impact felt like it might be the one that broke through. At some point, Sarah noticed Marcus wasn't moving normally, that there was blood on his jacket, but her voice was lost in the cacophony. And then, with the same sudden unpredictability that characterized its appearance, the creature stopped. The hammering ceased, the roof stopped groaning, and they heard or felt movement as it descended and moved away. Through windows, they caught glimpses of its massive form, circling the Snowcat slowly, almost leisurely, as if inspecting its handiwork. The creature moved around the entire perimeter, pausing occasionally to look in through windows, its face appearing suddenly and causing fresh spikes of terror. It reached out at one point and ran its hand along the side, and they could hear nails scraping against metal like fingernails on a chalkboard. Then it turned and began walking back toward the tree line, moving through deep snow with that same easy efficiency, long arms swinging slightly, massive shoulders rolling with an almost hypnotic gait. The creature reached the tree line and paused, turning back to face the Snowcat for a long moment. Marcus could have sworn the thing was assessing them, making some calculation about these intruders, deciding whether they'd learned their lesson. Then it vocalized one more time, a sound lower and more resonant than earlier screams, almost like a warning or declaration of ownership. The sound rolled across the clearing and echoed off surrounding trees, and then the creature turned and disappeared into the forest with a silence that seemed impossible for something so large. For several minutes, none of the 5 workers moved or spoke. They remained frozen in defensive positions, waiting for the attack to resume, unable to believe it might actually be over. The wind continued howling through massive trees, snow continued falling, and flares continued sputtering. But there was no sound of the creature. Marcus was first to find his voice, croaking out a question, asking if everyone was okay, receiving shaky affirmatives. He slowly pushed himself upright and immediately regretted it as pain lanced through his shoulder and chest. He realized he'd also sustained a cut on his forehead and blood had been running down his face, freezing in the cold. Jennifer assessed his condition and determined that while his injuries appeared painful and would require medical attention, they weren't immediately life-threatening. The shoulder was separated or possibly dislocated. The forehead cut was bleeding, but not severely. In the rear compartment, the situation was more dire. When Robert tried to move away from the door, he discovered he couldn't put weight on his left leg without excruciating pain. At some point during the attack, something had given way in his knee. The adrenaline had masked the injury, but now the pain was overwhelming. Sarah helped him to a sitting position, and when she carefully cut away his pants fabric to examine the knee, what she saw made her breath catch. The knee was swollen to nearly twice normal size, already showing purple and black bruising suggesting serious internal damage. Bent at an angle that knees shouldn't bend at David, shaking but apparently uninjured beyond bruising, cautiously examined the rear door damage. The frame was bent inward, the door deformed and showing deep gouges that might have been caused by the creature's nails. The door would still close but wouldn't seal properly, and cold air poured through gaps. They used emergency blankets and spare clothing to try sealing the worst gaps, working with numb fingers and mounting fear that the cold might finish what the creature had started. The temperature was already dropping noticeably inside the rear compartment. Marcus decided to try moving the vehicle to attempt driving back toward town. The alternative was remaining where they were, possibly for hours or days, and that seemed like certain death given Robert's injury, the damage, the cold, and the creature that might return. He turned the key in the ignition, and for a horrible moment, nothing happened. Then he tried again, pumping the accelerator and adjusting the choke, and the engine coughed once, twice, then caught and rumbled to life, a sound bringing almost physical relief. Marcus tested the controls. The vehicle responded sluggishly, and the grinding noise was now accompanied by worrying vibration, suggesting the track damage was significantly worse. but the Snowcat was mobile, and that was all that mattered. He eased the throttle forward and began turning to face back down the logging road toward town. They had traveled perhaps half a mile, moving at little more than walking speed, when Jennifer spotted movement ahead through the cracked windshield. Her breath caught, and she grabbed Marcus's arm with enough force to make him wince, pointing toward the tree line on their left, where shadows moved among massive tree trunks. The creature was there, paralleling their movement, staying just inside the forest, where trees provided cover but clearly visible as its massive form moved between trunks. It was keeping pace easily, its long stride covering ground far faster than the struggling Snowcat, showing no signs of exertion, simply maintaining its position relative to their vehicle with ease that made their mechanical advantage seem pathetically inadequate. Marcus increased their speed as much as he dared, but the track damage limited them to perhaps 8 or 10 miles per hour, and the creature continued pacing them with no apparent effort, occasionally moving closer and giving them clear glimpses of its massive size, occasionally falling back into deeper forest, but never disappearing entirely. It was clear the thing was tracking them deliberately, and the implications were absolutely terrifying. This was not random animal behavior. This was something else, something suggesting planning, intelligence, perhaps even deliberate malevolence or territorial aggression beyond simple instinct. The creature was making a choice to follow them, investing energy in tracking their movements, suggesting it had some plan or intention regarding them. A mile further down the road, the decision about whether to continue was made by mechanical failure. The damaged track finally gave out completely, one of the drive sprockets shearing off with a sound like a gunshot that made everyone jump in terror. The Snowcat lurched violently right, and Marcus fought the controls, trying to avoid plowing into a tree, managing to bring them to a grinding halt at an angle across the road. Now, completely immobile and utterly dependent on rescue that might be hours or days away, Marcus tried the controls desperately, but it was no use. One track spinning uselessly, while the other remained locked. They were stranded, truly and completely, and through the trees to their left, they could see the creature had stopped as well, and was now standing fully visible at the forest edge, perhaps 40 meters distant, watching them with what seemed like patience or satisfaction, as if it had known this would happen. The situation was rapidly becoming untenable. Moving from terrifying to potentially fatal, Robert's knee had swollen to ridiculous proportions, despite Sarah's attempts to stabilize it with improvised splints, clearly requiring medical intervention far beyond their capabilities. Marcus's shoulder was limiting his mobility severely. David was showing signs of shock, hands trembling uncontrollably, breathing in rapid, shallow gasps, eyes taking on a glassy quality. They gathered in the cab, abandoning the rear compartment because it had become too cold, the gaps in the damaged door allowing frigid wind to pour in. The cab was cramped with 5 people, but the combined body heat meant it was their best chance for survival. They assessed their options with grim realism. The radio equipment had been damaged during the attack, and while Jennifer worked frantically to repair it, she wasn't optimistic. Their cell phones remained useless. They had an emergency beacon that should have been their salvation, but when David retrieved it, they discovered it had been activated prematurely, possibly during the attack, then damaged, the case cracked, and internal electronics exposed to moisture that had frozen, rendering it non-functional. Their only real option was to wait and hope their failure to check in would trigger a search and rescue operation. Standard protocol required all crews to radio in every 2 hours. Their next check-in was scheduled for 1 p.m., about 90 minutes away. When they failed to check in, the company would try to reach them, and when that failed, they would begin organizing rescue. They might be looking at 4 to 6 hours before a rescue team could reach them, possibly longer in these conditions. 4 to 6 hours in a damaged vehicle with injuries requiring medical attention. with a creature of unknown intentions watching from the tree line and with temperatures that continued dropping. They decided to take shifts, two people always awake and watching while others tried to rest and conserve energy. They rationed food and water supplies carefully. They kept the engine running to provide heat, despite knowing fuel wasn't unlimited, but the alternative was freezing to death. And they waited, watching the creature that continued watching them from the tree line, that massive form standing motionless for long periods, then occasionally moving short distances along the forest edge, but never approaching again and never disappearing entirely. The afternoon crawled by with agonizing slowness as they waited for rescue, as they monitored Robert's declining condition and David's worrying psychological state, as they tried to keep warm and stay alert and not give in to despair. The creature remained visible at the forest edge, sometimes sitting in a disturbingly human-like way, with long arms resting on its knees, sometimes standing and swaying slightly, occasionally moving along the tree line as if patrolling. Sarah, during her watch shift with Marcus, noticed something that made the situation even more disturbing. As light began fading with approaching evening, she caught glimpses of movement deeper in the forest, other large shapes that might have been more creatures or might have been shadows and snow playing tricks. She stared into the forest for long minutes, trying to determine if what she was seeing was real, and slowly became convinced she wasn't hallucinating, that there actually were other shapes moving among trees, keeping to deeper shadows, but occasionally visible. She mentioned this to Marcus in a whisper, and he stared with her. He couldn't be certain. Visibility was too poor and light too dim, but he had growing conviction that Sarah was right, that there were indeed more creatures in the forest surrounding their position, that they were encircled. He counted what might be separate individuals, identifying movement patterns suggesting at least 3 and possibly 4 additional creatures beyond the one maintaining its obvious position. The implications were staggering. If there were multiple creatures, that suggested not just an isolated individual, but possibly a family group or small population, which suggested these things maintained social structures and possibly culture. It also meant their situation was even more desperate, because if the creatures decided to attack again, they might face multiple assailants working together. Marcus decided not to share this observation with the others beyond Sarah. Robert was already in severe pain, showing signs of infection. David was barely holding together psychologically, and Jennifer was exhausted. Adding to their psychological burden seemed cruel. As darkness fell, they had to decide about the engine and fuel consumption. They couldn't run it all night continuously. The fuel gauge showed perhaps half a tank remaining, translating to maybe 6 or 8 hours of continuous operation. But shutting it down meant confronting temperatures that would drop well below zero. They decided on a compromise, running the engine in 30-minute cycles, on to build heat, then off to conserve fuel, a pattern that would hopefully keep them alive while not exhausting fuel before rescue arrived. The first cycle off was absolutely brutal. The temperature dropped with shocking speed, the metal vehicle offering almost no insulation. Within minutes, their breath was freezing on windows. Within 10 minutes, they were all shaking uncontrollably, teeth chattering so hard they couldn't speak clearly, fingers and toes going numb. They huddled together in a tight group, sharing what little body heat they could generate, pressing against each other without embarrassment because survival trumped social niceties. Robert was in the middle, his damaged leg surrounded by others' warmth, his body shaking with fever from infection. David was also in the middle, his smaller frame surrounded by larger bodies, his shaking suggesting his system was beginning to shut down. 20 minutes into the first cycle, Marcus restarted early, unable to watch his crew suffer. They adjusted to 20-minute cycles instead of 30. Gambling rescue would arrive before fuel ran out. The night became an endurance test. fighting the urge to surrender to cold, exhaustion, and pain. The rhythm of warmth and cold became hypnotic. 20 minutes of slowly building heat where they could move and speak, followed by 20 minutes of worsening cold where they focused purely on survival. Fear of another attack never left them. Deep in the night, around 3 or 4 a.m., they heard unmistakable vocalizations from the forest, not aggressive screams, but something else. Sounds like language, like communication. The calls came from multiple directions, at least 4 distinct voices surrounding the Snowcat. The exchange lasted 10 to 15 minutes, varying in pitch and rhythm, in ways suggesting genuine communication. When silence returned, they wondered what had been decided, what plans made. The implications were disturbing. It suggested social organization and intelligence that made the creatures far more dangerous than simple animal behavior. Dawn finally came, bringing light but little warmth. The snow had stopped and visibility improved dramatically. What they saw offered no comfort. Enormous tracks surrounded the Snowcat, showing individual toe marks, far too large for any known animal. The creatures had circled repeatedly during the night, approaching within feet of the vehicle but choosing not to attack, counting carefully. They estimated 4 to 6 individuals, with tracks ranging from 14 to 18 inches. As daylight strengthened, the creature from the tree line emerged again, taking its watching position 40 meters away. In better light, they could see it clearly. Massive, 8.5 feet tall, 600 to 800 pounds, covered in thick reddish-brown hair. Its proportions were distinctly non-human. Impossibly broad shoulders, arms reaching nearly to knees, disproportionately large hands. The face was most disturbing, shockingly human-like yet fundamentally alien, but the eyes haunted them most, large, dark, tracking their movements with unmistakable intelligence. Hours crawled by. They had missed their 1 p.m. check-in yesterday, which should have triggered immediate rescue. The delay suggested either operational problems or protocol failures. Robert's condition deteriorated alarmingly. His fever spiked higher, consciousness fading in and out. His grotesquely swollen knee showed red streaks up his thigh, blood poisoning spreading systemically. He needed intravenous antibiotics, surgical cleaning, possibly amputation. David's psychological state worsened, shock deepening into near catatonia. His responses became slower, less coherent, his eyes blank as his mind retreated. Marcus's separated shoulder caused constant severe pain. Jennifer, physically uninjured, suffered psychological strain from constant vigilance early afternoon. Perhaps 30 hours after the attack, they finally heard an engine approaching. The sound grew louder. Rescue was arriving. The vehicle stopped 50 meters away. Marcus stumbled out, waving frantically for help. The rescue crew moved forward but froze when they saw the creature at the tree line. Their reaction confirmed everything. This was real. The creature stood fully visible, an impossible sight. For a long moment, everyone stared in stunned silence. Then the creature vocalized that bone-chilling scream, making the rescue crew stumble backward. The sound echoed endlessly before cutting off. The creature turned and melted into the forest with impossible silence. The rescue crew rushed forward, loading all 5 workers quickly while glancing nervously at the tree line. Robert, semi-conscious with raging fever, needed immediate evacuation. The paramedics started IV fluids and antibiotics before they'd even secured him. David, non-responsive, had to be physically guided into the vehicle. The supervisor called for helicopter evacuation to meet them at a designated clearing. As they drove away, Jennifer looked back and saw movement in the trees. 4 distinct, massive shapes watching them leave. She said nothing, but knew with certainty that multiple creatures had surrounded them all along the helicopter evacuation went smoothly. Robert's emergency surgery saved his leg, though he'd need multiple operations and months of rehabilitation. Marcus required shoulder surgery. David was hospitalized in psychiatric care for 3 weeks. All received treatment for various injuries, frostbite and shock. The aftermath was complicated and contentious. All 5 gave detailed statements to multiple authorities. The rescue crew corroborated seeing the creature. Investigation teams found the damaged Snowcat exactly as described, with damage exceeding any known wildlife capability. They documented and cast the numerous footprints, the largest measuring 18.3 inches, showing over 700 pounds of weight. The timber company halted operations pending investigation. Environmental groups seized on the incident as proof logging was too intrusive. Cryptozoology researchers descended in droves. The workers became unwilling celebrities in a controversy they wanted no part of, their trauma becoming fodder for documentaries and endless debates. None returned to Olympic Peninsula forestry. Marcus relocated to California, later leaving the industry entirely. Jennifer returned to automotive repair, never camping again. Robert took medical retirement, his knee never recovering, eventually divorcing as he struggled with chronic pain and nightmares. Sarah moved to Arizona, David to Kansas, both seeking distance from the forests that nearly killed them. For the 5 who lived through it, there was no controversy or doubt. They knew with absolute certainty what they'd encountered. They'd paid a terrible price for that knowledge, physical injuries that would never fully heal, psychological trauma echoing through their lives, understanding that humanity's dominance was more tenuous than believed, that there were still places where humans weren't welcome, where they existed at the sufferance of beings that could destroy them effortlessly. And in the Olympic forests, deep in unexplored territories, the creatures continued their existence, watching and waiting, defending their territories when necessary, living according to patterns humans couldn't understand. Reminders that the world still held genuine mysteries, that some things were meant to remain unknown, glimpsed only briefly by those unfortunate enough to venture where humans were never meant to go.